So I am thrilled to introduce Congressman Moulton. He is an outstanding champion for high-speed rail. He's introduced the American High-Speed Rail Act, which would fund high-speed rail to the tune of $205 billion. We worked closely with Congressman Moulton over the past 2 years to fight incredibly hard for high-speed rail funding in the Inflation Reduction Act, as well as the bipartisan infrastructure law. And he's just an incredible example of visionary political leadership when it comes to this issue. Really looking out for high-speed rail at the national level, not as a parochial issue for his district. So I want to welcome him, Congressman Moulton.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here and to see such a vibrant, excited room full of supporters. I recognize that I'm in many ways preaching to the converted here. So I want to get quickly past the preaching and on to the questions so that we can all participate in the conversation. But what I'd like to talk about is not just the facts of high-speed rail, because I'm sure most of you in the room know those pretty well, but a little bit more about the vision and how we sell this to America. Because the vision here, I think we don't talk about enough. We don't talk about what a difference this will make in people's lives. We think about it as a great technology. We think about it as something that the rest of the world has that we don't. What we really need to do is bring this home to America and show Americans how this will improve their lives every single day. One of the examples I like to talk about is how Beijing to Shanghai, which is now the most popular high-speed rail line in the world, is about the same distance as Chicago to Atlanta. Most Americans don't think about high-speed rail in that kind of corridor, right? But we know that Atlanta has a very congested airport. We know that Chicago has an infamously congested airport. You could pour billions of dollars into expanding Hartsfield-Jackson and expanding O'Hare. And that would be good for the economy of Atlanta. It would be good for the economy of Chicago, but it wouldn't do anything for any of the cities in between. But imagine if we put that money instead into building a high-speed rail line from Chicago to Atlanta, and what that would do to connect the small towns or smaller cities, communities throughout the Midwest, throughout the Rust Belt that have been left behind from much of our economic growth over the last 20 years. Think about what that would do to knit together America, not just benefiting the wealthy cities that already are planning these kinds of systems, but everybody in between. That's really part of the vision of high-speed rail, what it does to bring us together as a country at a very divided time. There's also just a very strong economic argument for high-speed rail. So when you look at the political spectrum and see many conservatives generally opposed to high-speed rail, it tends to be more Democrats, more people on the left who are supportive of it. Call out the fiscal argument for high-speed rail. I like to reference the study in the Pacific Northwest, funded in part by Microsoft, where they looked at the Cascadia corridor, Portland, Seattle, and Vancouver. And they said, look, if you build this high-speed rail system, it could cost $40 billion. Now, this is all round numbers and, but just for argument's sake, $40 billion, that's a lot of money. We have a historic level of funding for rail in the infrastructure bill just passed at about $66 billion, right? So imagine spending almost 2/3 of that on one high-speed rail line. That's a lot of money. But you spend $40 billion and you get $355 billion in economic benefits. That's a pretty good return on investment. I'm sure a lot of you would like to see that from your IRAs, right? That's a good ROI. And not only that, but they looked at, okay, well, what's an alternative? Well, adding one lane to I-5 in either direction, just one lane, would cost $80 billion, so twice that amount, $80 billion. And then what kind of economic benefit do you get from spending $80 billion on widening I-5? Arguably none. In fact, you could argue that there actually would be a negative economic benefit. You would have an economic benefit from construction because you're pouring $80 billion into the economy. There's a lot of jobs there in an $80 billion project. But at the end of the day, through induced demand, you just have more cars on the highway, which means more cars in downtown Portland, Seattle, Tacoma, Vancouver. Congestion goes up, and that has a negative economic impact. So just think about the math there. You're either plus $315 billion after a $40 billion investment, or you're negative, you're underwater, you're negative 80 plus, maybe negative 80, 100 after spending 80. So fiscal conservatives should love high-speed rail. It's a smarter investment. It's a smarter use of taxpayer dollar. Now, if you're on the left and you're concerned about climate goals, you're saying, how are we going to achieve the ambitious agenda that the president has set out? I think it's hard to envision how we get there when you really look into the full economics of electric vehicles. It costs a lot of carbon to produce an electric vehicle. Does anyone know what the all-in costs of, producing a Tesla are? The all-in carbon costs and sort of the life cycle. So when you're using a Tesla every single day, you're saving carbon, right? We all understand that. Better to use an electric vehicle than something that takes gas. But it takes a lot of carbon to produce that electric vehicle, especially to produce the battery. And by the way, I'm not even mentioning the child labor and other issues that are associated with battery production. Let's just look at the carbon costs. But how does that work out? How many years, how many miles do you have to drive a Tesla in order to make up for the carbon cost of producing it? Does anybody know? Well, here's the problem. I don't know either, because Congress is not even looking at this seriously. We're not even really asking this question. We're just totally bought in to this agenda of subsidizing the hell out of electric vehicles to the tune of hundreds of billions of dollars without really understanding what they're going to do to the overall carbon picture of the planet. And it's not that hard to figure out from what little data is out there that you have to drive a Tesla a lot to make back the carbon cost. So if you get in an Uber and it's an electric vehicle, you're probably doing a good thing, because that thing is getting used a lot, constantly driving people around. But if you're buying a Tesla for your own private vehicle, it's not even clear whether you're actually helping the environment or hurting it. This is the kind of serious discussion that we have to have on the left about high-speed rail. So when you look at this political picture, it's a little bit complicated. There are different goals on either side of the political spectrum, but understanding the politics of this and selling the vision for what a difference this will make in people's lives is how we actually get this over the finish line. So I would love to go now to the conversation that Ezra and I are going to have, and then take your questions. I'm happy to talk about anything at all, but my real interest is how we convert the enthusiasm, the knowledge, and the understanding in this room into action across America. All right?
Yeah. Where do you want me to say? Where do you want me to say here?
Well, thank you so much, Congressman Moulton. I think one of the things you talked about that's really interesting is the strong interest on Capitol Hill in subsidizing electric vehicles. Why do you think EVs are just taken so much more seriously than high-speed rail as a solution when it comes to decarbonizing transportation? Why is this barely even part of the picture? And what can we do about that?
Well, I mean, there are a few reasons. I mean, one reason, of course, is that America has a very car-centric culture, and we've had that for a long time. But that doesn't mean that rail can't be very successful. And we have sprawly suburbs because we've subsidized the hell out of cars, the oil that it takes to fuel cars, and the highways that you need to use them for decades. But you all of you who flew into Washington could see from the air exactly where all the metro stations are, because that's where you have the high rises. That's where the most expensive real estate is. That's where you have the compact, more sustainable development that follows from investing in this kind of transportation. So I think too often in America, we think about, how do we just service the situation that we have, as opposed to build the kind of sustainable communities that we want in the future. Everywhere in the world, including in the United States of America, it's been shown that when you build good rail service, people will use it. I mean, even on the Northeast Corridor, Acela tickets are very expensive. I hear this all the time from my friends who know that how I feel about high-speed rail, and they say, "Well, Seth, I'd like to take the train, but the train's too expensive." But that's a very good argument for how good the train is, right? Amtrak charges those prices because they can afford to charge those prices because people want that service. But to get back to your question, I mean, there's a big part of this. It's just, hey, we all have cars, so it's just easy to convert to electric vehicles. And I think a lot of this has been rather thoughtless, rather mindless, just saying, we'll make that transition, and of course it's better, without really doing the math behind what all this entails. The second thing is that there's just a lot of political forces, the lobbyists in this town, who try to influence people like me about these decisions. And you think the auto lobby has a big influence in Washington? They sure as hell do. You think the airline lobby has a big influence in Washington? Yeah, they sure as hell do. You think the oil lobby has a big influence in Washington?
What about the high-speed rail lobby?
Well, I think we need to increase the influence.
We're working on it. Well, I think one of the other concerns is that it's just taking so long to build high-speed rail in the US. The IPCC said a few years ago, we need to cut emissions in half globally by 2030. That's, what is that, 7 years from now? And it's taking, in the US, how long is it taking to build your average high-speed rail project? 10, 15 years? How do we
know, because we don't have a high-speed
exactly
rail.
So what does it look like to start taking, we're in a climate emergency. What does it look like to start developing high-speed rail on an emergency basis and get out of this kind of business as usual approach?
So before I came to Congress, I worked on the Texas Central project. I was a project manager down in Texas. So I have some on the ground experience with trying to get a high-speed rail project off the ground. And as we all know, this is a great project. It makes a tremendous amount of sense. It's crazy that we didn't do this 50 years ago, and yet it's still not built, right? One of my colleagues, my good friend who worked on the project for longer than I did, said every time that he talked to his dad, he said, son, have you laid any ties today? And we've not laid a single tie for Dallas to Houston high-speed rail. And part of my realization working down there is that the problem is not just sort of at that level and getting things going. It's at the political level. It's things I could influence here in Washington that's really holding this back. And one of the major issues is environmental reviews. One of the biggest things holding back Texas Central in Texas is environmental reviews, which is ironic given not just that it's in Texas where people think there are no real environmental considerations, but it's ironic because this is a project that's so fundamentally good for the environment. So it's a little bit crazy that we have an Environmental Policy Act that hinders the development of projects that are fundamentally really good for the environment. So when NEPA holds up a 10-lane highway, NEPA's doing its job because that's really bad for the environment. When NEPA holds up a high-speed rail line, then it's backfiring. And I think the political opportunity here is to bring in some conservatives who want to see reforms to NEPA with Democrats, with liberals who want to see high-speed rail, and say, let's do a pilot project with a technology that we can all agree is fundamentally good for the environment, and expedite the environmental reviews.
But when we bring that up, we say we want to expedite high-speed rail, the high-speed rail permitting process in Congress. Even people on the blue side of the aisle say that's dead on arrival, Ezra, because Republicans don't like high-speed rail. What do we do about that?
I think, I mean, this is why it's so important to get one project done. Because I think once you have Republicans riding high-speed trains, this view is going to change. And it's one of the reasons why with the Biden administration, I have been such a strong advocate for the Texas project. Now, I always have to caveat this with the fact that I worked on the Texas project. I don't have any stock in the Texas project, which is probably a good thing right now. But I think the most important thing about the Texas project is that it's in a red state. Because if Texas Republicans start liking high-speed rail, that really changes the political dynamic here in Washington.
And, how do we, apart from getting a project done, which is a few years off, how do we expand our coalition in the meantime? For a lot of members, this feels kind of distant. It's not, not going to be happening in their district as far as they can tell anytime soon. So why should they care about it, especially rural members?
Great question. Great question. So I think that there's work that needs to be done. I tried to sort of address the high level points here in my introduction. One, you have to sell the vision, right? And in selling the vision is about recognizing that high-speed rail in America is not just about the popular corridors that we all think it will obviously exist. It's not just about California and the Northeast corridor, and maybe something in the Pacific Northwest, and maybe something in Florida. When you put high-speed rail, if you take a map of the United States and you look at the corridors where it makes sense, which are generally about 750 miles or less, what you quickly see when you put these corridors on a map is that they're contiguous, right? So you're not going to take a high-speed train from Chicago to Los Angeles. Well, actually, probably everyone in the room here would. But most Americans are not going to take a train all the way from Chicago to Los Angeles. But you would take a train from Chicago to Omaha. You would take a train from Omaha to Denver. You would take a train from Denver to Salt Lake. And you would take a train from Salt Lake to LA every single day over flying. And when you string those corridors together, you realize that you have a completely national network. So it is not hard to envision a day where you can take an overnight high-speed sleeper train from Chicago to Los Angeles if you want. But even more importantly, while there won't be a lot of passengers going all the way from Chicago to Los Angeles, just because the distance is so long, there will be a hell of a lot of packages taking that route, which, by the way, changes the financial equation for high-speed rail quite a bit. So my point is that when people stop thinking about this as just something that's good for blue state Illinois and good for blue Northeast corridor and good for blue California, but it's really good for places like Omaha as well, then you change the political dynamics of this vision. And that's why, of all the different, endpoints I could pick when I talk about high-speed rail, I love to talk about Chicago and Atlanta, because everyone knows that Chicago's doing fine, Atlanta doing fine, but everyone also knows that a lot of those smaller cities in between not doing so well. My home state of Boston, we mostly talk about high-speed rail to New York because we're already used to taking the Acela, which is certainly not high speed, but we're used to getting on that train. We don't talk enough about what it would mean to be able to take high-speed rail to Chicago. Now, when you look at the frequency of weather delays on that corridor, it's a pretty long high-speed rail corridor. It'd probably be about a 4 or 5 hour trip. But when you look at how often those flights are delayed in both the summer and the winter, you realize there's a huge market for Boston to Chicago high-speed rail service. But more importantly, think about what that does for Buffalo. Think about what that does for Cleveland. Think about what that does for South Bend, Indiana. You can't live in South Bend, Indiana and work in downtown Chicago, no matter what great AI biotech job or whatever else is downtown Chicago. And you sure as hell can't get home in time to have dinner with your kids. But with high-speed rail, you could. selling that vision and showing Americans how it's not just about great service for the wealthy cities that already have trains today, but how it really knits together America and brings economic benefits to the places that have been left out of much of the economic growth of the last 20 or 30 years. I think that's really critical.
Well, on that note, tell me about this caucus that you're launching with Rep. Beyer, the High Speed and Intercity Passenger Rail Caucus. Well,
what we're trying to do with this caucus is talk about this vision to more of our colleagues. You know, I have I've been in Congress for about 8 years. I've not been on the transportation committee for that for as long as that. And one of the things that I have done just being a member of the committee is when debates come up about high-speed rail, you know, I just take everybody on. And there hasn't been someone on the committee who's really done that because, you know, a lot of people say that I have, you know, the leader in Congress on high-speed rail. I frankly wish that I wasn't. I wish there were 20 people who were better at high-speed rail than I am. But having me on the committee has really changed the dynamic a lot of those debates. A lot of Republicans who used to, pardon the pun, rail against high-speed rail have now changed to say, well, we don't dislike all high-speed rail, just California. That's actually a really important semantic change in how conservatives are arguing against high-speed rail. And in part, it's because I've been making these economic arguments to conservatives. You know, and if you're someone who stands on fiscal responsibility and you can show that this is a better investment for taxpayer dollars than expanding airports or expanding highways, it's a little hard to argue against that. But there hasn't been someone on the committee to make that argument in the past. So since I've joined the committee, I've had several Republicans come up to me privately and say, you know, Seth, I'd really like to learn more about this. You know, let's go on a high-speed rail Codel to see some of these systems in other parts of the world. So the point of the caucus is to have the effect that I've been trying to bring to the Transportation Committee more broadly across Congress, to be evangelists in a sense, and just bring people up to speed, to educate members who may not understand these dynamics, may not understand the basic economics of high-speed rail, who may not understand some of the problems with electric vehicles, who may not understand, you know, what this could mean for the smaller communities in America, not just the big coastal cities, you know, to essentially win more people over to what I think is clearly the truth here.
All right, well, I've got a personal question for you, and then we're going to open it up to the audience to see if we've got any questions at this point. So if our mic holders can mobilize, great. So, you know, what's your high-speed rail story? How did you become this high-speed rail true believer and wind up working at Texas Central and then get into this position? Did you go ride it somewhere, or what happened?
I mean, I have ridden high-speed trains overseas in Europe and Asia, but I think what I've recognized about transportation is that transportation is much bigger than getting from point A to point B. Transportation fundamentally influences the kind of communities that we have. The kind of, you know, I grew up on the North Shore of Massachusetts. We still have great downtown, individual character. We are not a region of highways and chain malls. Highways and strip malls and chain restaurants. We're a place where you can tell the accent difference between Salem and Danvers, where each town has.
Can you do an impression?
A real Danvers is pretty rough. Where, you know, there are microeconomies and small businesses that are thriving, and people can walk to where they need to go. They don't need to get in a car for everything they need to do. We essentially have small town America that a lot of the rest of the country wants on the North Shore, and that's largely driven by the fact that we have these are railroad towns. That we don't have massive highways going through our district, with really just one exception. And we actually have places where people can walk from downtown train stations, and this is the type of community that's developed. So what interests me about high-speed rail is not the curiosity of being able to go really fast in a train, but the fact that this can actually fundamentally improve the way that we live, the communities that we have, all across the country. We can actually, get back to the kind of small town communities that we miss, that we don't have when we just have sprawly suburbs and chain restaurants and big conglomerates, and everybody has to, drive to a mall to go shopping or have fun or hang out as a kid. I mean, I don't think that's the kind of country that we fundamentally want to live in. And rather than trying to, artificially construct these types of more walkable, more sustainable communities, we just need to build the transportation systems that naturally incentivize their development.
Fantastic. Well, let's open it up to questions. Please rate. Wow, we got them coming all over the place. Let's start off with Peter Kennedy. Why don't you're just right here, so why don't you go ahead?
Yeah. Sure, it's a great question. What kinds of reforms to NEPA would I advocate for? And I'm going to caveat this up front by saying I'm not a NEPA expert per se. I've had some practical experience with the challenges, and I see this a bit at a high level from the transportation committee. But a few things. One, there should be clear timelines where agencies have very clear timelines, deadlines for which they have to complete their reviews, so they can't just keep dragging this out. And projects wait, oh, well, they said it was going to be in June. Now they're saying August. We don't know why. It's just been delayed. This is a common refrain you hear from projects across the country. Second, I think that you need, you obviously want to have a public review process, but there also should be some limits on that. You can't just have individual citizens dragging this out for NIMBY reasons, for years. I think that we also have to look at the degree to which these projects have to rely on consulting firms, and I'm sure there are some representatives of consulting firms here, to complete this process, because that dramatically adds to the cost. When you really drill down into what is driving these costs here, it's not just the fact that the review takes a lot of time. It's not just the fact that there's a lot of paperwork. It's that it's so complex, you have to hire expensive outside consulting firms just to get you through the process. So that's a pretty high level answer. It's not very specific. I'll admit that, but those are some of the things I think we need to look at.
Thanks, Peter. Let's do John, and then Keith, and then Ben.
I can.
Yeah.
Thank you for being here. One idea to help solve real fire case. Alston has talked about it and perhaps
Yeah, I mean, I'm curious if he is. I don't know that he's a member of the caucus yet, but he certainly should be.
Yeah.
Well, we're just getting started, right?
Right.
So
But you make an excellent point. And this is one of the things that I'm just trying to encourage everyone in the room to do is let's just face the reality that we have a political challenge here with high-speed rail. I wish we could sell it purely on its merits, but that hasn't worked, folks. So let's be more in touch with the political reality here. And you've brought up an excellent point for another way that we can expand this political base.
thanks, John. So we got Keith Wilson and then Ben Treposis.
Congressman Moulton, it's a pleasure to see you, and thank you for your leadership. We've been following you for years.
Oh, state your organization as well.
Keith Wilson with Titan Freight Systems in Portland, Oregon, really trying to get the Cascadia high-speed rail project off the ground, or I should say on the rail. You've been great at bringing policy forward in Congress. You're running your act up that hill. The American High-Speed Rail Act is really what we need to set the true north on where we need to go. And what's your long-term vision, but then what's your short-term goals to really in charge us on following your leadership? What do you need from us? But let us know your short-term goal from a policy allocation and your long-term. Are we going to move that American High-Speed Rail Act forward?
Keith, thank you very much for your question. And I think you've phrased this well. The American High-Speed Rail Act, which would, among other things, put $250 billion into high-speed rail, is really that North Star It's the vision that I wanted to set out there for Congress to see where I think we should be going. And the practical reality, though, is that we're probably not going to pass that High-Speed Rail Act in its entirety anytime soon. I think the practical way to advance it is really to focus on how can we get a couple projects going on the ground. And those are not going to be funded through this massive act because we just don't have the political constituency right now to get it passed. But once you build that political constituency, not just through doing things like John is talking about, but by fundamentally building it, the popular support for high-speed rail, by having a couple of high-speed rail lines that people can ride and appreciate, then you're going to have the political will here in Washington to do much bigger things like the American High-Speed Rail Act. But here's the critical point. It's a North Star. It's a good guidepost. It's absolutely something we should do. We would be a better, stronger country if we pass it tomorrow. But the political reality is that the way we get to pass the American High-Speed Rail Act is by building high-speed rail, not the other way around.
Thank you. Ben Traposis, HMTB.
Congressman, thank you. Ben Traposis with HNCB, born in Somerville, so thank you for your leadership. Appreciate that very much. There was a time in the not too distant past where infrastructure, broadly, and transportation in particular, wasn't a partisan issue, that we funded transportation infrastructure improvements fairly comfortably and happily across the country, across party lines. Do you see any hope of getting transportation back to that? It's a good idea at any level, and having high-speed rail ultimately be part of that future investment and just keeping the house standing?
Yeah. Look, I could have come in this morning and presented the following argument. Democrats support high-speed rail, Republicans do not. So the best thing you can do for high-speed rail is to just elect Democrats so we get a majority in both the House and the Senate and we jam this through. That's not the argument that I'm making, because I think high-speed rail should fundamentally have support across the political spectrum, not just because it's good for the environment on the left, but because it's good for fiscal responsibility on the right. And there are a lot of other reasons too, but that's sort of a very simplistic way to break down what I think are some of the most compelling arguments. And so I would like to think that high-speed rail could be something that gets us back to that bipartisanship with regards to transportation funding that you're describing. I can foresee a world in the not too distant future where you have a lot of Texas Republicans who realize, wow, this Dallas to Houston thing is great. I want to be able to go to Oklahoma. I want to be able to go to New Orleans. And they're big advocates for high-speed rail funding. And they can team up with colleagues like mine from the Northeast to get more funding for high-speed rail overall. But I don't think we're going to get there until we do two things. One is to actually, like I say, get a high-speed rail line built so people can see this and hopefully have a lot of red state riders wherever this is built. I'm a big supporter of California high-speed rail, but that's not the political win that we really need here to advance this across the country. And then the second thing is, there are a lot of places around America where we just need to sell this vision, whether you're in Hornell, New York, and you're Hormel and you're trying to just sell the jobs it will create, or you're sitting in Cleveland and you're realizing this would be pretty amazing if we could get on a high-speed train to Chicago. So selling it at the more state and local level, I think is really important. One way that I'm doing this in Massachusetts is I'm talking about how the number one political issue in Massachusetts is affordable housing. A lot of people want to work in Massachusetts. There are a lot of great jobs there. People cannot afford to live right now in Massachusetts. Of course, if you know anything about Massachusetts, Boston's on the East Coast. Most of the jobs in Boston, most of the high growth, high paying jobs are in the eastern half of the state, or more accurately, the eastern quarter of the state, right? But on the other hand, there's a lot of housing available in other parts of the state. So if you had high-speed rail service from Boston to Springfield, Massachusetts, the westernmost large city, where you could get from Springfield to Boston, not in 2 hours by driving, but in 50 minutes on a high-speed train, think about what that would do for access to housing in Massachusetts. Think about what that would do for access to jobs for all the people living in Western Massachusetts who want access to these amazing jobs in Eastern Massachusetts. And it happens that Boston to Springfield, of course, is just the first leg of Boston to Chicago high-speed rail. When Massachusetts, though, is thinking about improving rail service, their current plan is to build a 19th century rail line to Springfield that candidly no one's going to ride because it's too damn slow. Now, Morocco just built a high-speed rail line, 200-mile-per-hour high-speed rail line. Morocco has a fifth the percentage GDP of Massachusetts. In other words, Massachusetts GDP is 5 times the entire country of Morocco, and yet they've been able to build high-speed rail. And how long is their high-speed rail line? It's about 20 miles longer than Boston to Springfield. So when Massachusetts, just acting on its own to make a transportation investment to improve access to housing in the state, is thinking about how to do this, they should be investing in high-speed rail. They should not be investing in 19th century train service, which is what the current plan is. But that also lays the groundwork for the larger vision that we're talking about. You can, it's not that hard to imagine sitting in a Springfield train station and realizing that you can get to Boston in 50 minutes and saying, well, why can't I go west from here and get to Albany, you know, in 15 minutes?
Thank you. Terry.
Congressman Terry Hines with Sidley Austin. I agree with you that there isn't the political will to pass your high-speed rail bill at the present time. And as you know, financing is a big problem to get these early projects started. There is a program, you're familiar with the RIF program at FRA? It's there. It's kind of a man bites dog story. It's one of the only stories I ever heard of where Congress appropriated money in the 1970s and they never spent it. There's $30 billion there. The problem is that greenfield projects like these high-speed rail projects have a hard time persuading FRA to make the loan. What can we do, Congress do, perhaps to tweak the law to have them take not only into account sort of the green eye shade banker approach is, you know, in terms of credit of this thing, but also take into account, you know, these other national priorities, climate change and better mobility and so forth, all the benefits that you were talking about earlier. Somehow goes into the mix in determining whether to use those funds. Those funds are there today,
Right,
that could fund these first 2 projects.
yeah, great question, Terry. I mean, I think that the banker answer to your question is we need to subsidize the credit risk premium for these loans, right? And ensure maybe, you know, Congress might figure out how to do this. But really what needs to happen is the Biden administration FRA just needs to figure out a way to get this done. And, you know, look, I'll be honest, I've been very frustrated with the pace of this DOT when it comes to high-speed rail projects. And I've sat in the, you know, around a table with Pauly Trottenberg, who's great, and others, and really made the case for advancing this. But the more people in this room who have connections to the higher ups at FRA can get in and make this argument that the window here is closing to get this money out the door, because God knows who might be the next president. We've got to act quickly if you want to, you know, fulfill this vision. And I've made the argument to the president himself that if you want to do something transformative for this country, if you want to be remembered as a president who's made a huge impact on this country with your transportation bill, it's not going to be by building more Amtrak service that goes at, again, 19th century speeds. Most Amtrak routes today were faster in the 1930s. And yet that's what we want to double down on. I think that's incredibly short-sighted. If, on the other hand, the president takes this $66 billion in rail money and doesn't spread it out a bunch of, amongst dozens and dozens of 79-mile-an-hour high rail projects that fundamentally not many people are going to ride because it's so damn slow, and instead starts a high-speed rail revolution by having 1 or 2 really successful high-speed rail projects, that's a legacy that people will credit the president for. But more people need to make this argument because, frankly, I've tried and I haven't convinced them yet.
Thank you. I will note we're really excited to be hearing from Andy Byford, who's Amtrak's new Senior Vice President for High Speed Rail tomorrow. So we're looking forward to that one. Peter, go ahead.
You missed your window. Well, I mean, Peter, you're not wrong, but my view is that we should not be making that argument, because what it sounds like you're saying is that to make LA to San Francisco high-speed rail successful, it's actually going to cost even more than we're saying, because we have to do all these we have to make all these changes to the transportation systems, the transit systems in LA, and the same thing in San Francisco to make it successful. And I would argue that a lot of those changes are just going to are going to come naturally, because of the kind of development that high-speed rail incentivizes. So I wouldn't argue that, yes, it's great in Europe that you can take a tram to a high-speed rail station to get on the train. But it's also pretty great that if you buy a first-class ticket on Brightline, you get an Uber that shows up at your door. Amtrak's been around for what, 40 years, 50 years? They haven't figured that out yet. Brightline did it in like 6 months, right? That's the kind of innovation that we should be selling here. And I don't doubt that if you have a lot more people coming to LAUPT, or what do they call it now, Los Angeles Union Station or something. I don't know why they had to bastardize the name of it, but if you have more people coming to that station, there's going to be a lot of political will to improve the transit service and other in other sort of intra-city transportation around that station. But don't say that high-speed rail is dependent on it, because then it sounds like this is actually going to cost even more than the large price tags we're already seeing. My view.
Thank you. Mike Efoff, Brotherhood of Railroad Signalmen.
I appreciate that very much. A place where I think that labor could be particularly helpful, because of again, we're talking nitty-gritty politics here, because of your influence with the left, is on the NEPA reforms that we need to get these projects moving more quickly. Because when labor gets behind some environmental reforms, which again, like, we're not talking about eviscerating environmental laws. We're talking about making environmental laws better support environmentally friendly projects, right? This is not high-speed rail, but in my district in Beverly, Massachusetts, which is a great, how many people live in small cities with 5 commuter rail stations in that one city? Beverly's a great city, great spot to live. And it's got a bridge that was that's over 100 years old, that was just recently condemned. This bridge, I mean, it's like, 2 lengths of this room here. It's like a 100-yard bridge, maybe a little bit longer, right? And what the NEPA process dictates is that to replace this bridge, they're going to have to do all sorts of studies, months and months of studies, to then dismantle the bridge that they have. I mean, look, any old general contractor could take this thing down in about 5 hours. It's so decrepit. But they're going to do months and months of studies to dismantle the bridge. Then they're designing a new temporary bridge to put up next to the old bridge. And then they're going to build another new bridge where the old bridge was. And this process to replace a bridge that's, you can easily throw a football to the other end of the bridge, is going to take 6 years. And explain to me how it's better for the environment that across this little river in Beverly, we're building 2 bridges to replace 1. I mean, that's just absurd. Tear down the bridge in 5 days and build another bridge in 3 months, and you're done. But our current NEPA process won't allow us to do that. And the more that you can explain that to my Democratic colleagues, that would really help, advance this. look, at the end of the day, you know, you have a tough job of convincing some of your, you know, more conservative, I don't mean politically conservative, but just, you know, more set in their ways type of old railroader guys, that this is the wave of the future, that the wave of the future is not just being comfortable in the job that you've had for a long time, but doing some of this new exciting stuff. But at the end of the day, the more high-speed rail we have, the more people are using rail in America. That's just more jobs. That's just way more jobs than doubling down on the 19th century rail system that we have. Yes.
Thank you, Mike. Well, Congressman Moulton, we're out of time. Do you want to offer any concluding remarks?
Look, let me just say this. If you can take a couple of things away here, let's sell the vision of high-speed rail and sell it not just to the places that already support it, but to the places in between that really could benefit from high-speed rail. And then let's just be really smart and strategic about what the political roadblocks are, what the political constituencies are that we have to win over. I look forward to being a partner with you in this effort. And I'll tell you what, I have not been more optimistic about high-speed rail in a long time. There are plenty of places, I do a lot of national security work. There are plenty of places in the world that look more pessimistic today than they did 10 years ago. And that's not a good thing. That's why a lot of people are frustrated around here. That's why a lot of people are concerned about the future of our country and the future of national security and things like this. But I'm actually quite optimistic about the future of high-speed rail. And I really do think that once we get one or two projects done, we're going to see an inflection point. That's why it's so important that we really build the momentum to get a couple projects done quickly, and then we'll build from there. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Congressman Seth Moulton. Fantastic. Thank you very much.